Rounding out the initial quartet of Xbox Studio titles announced for PlayStation 5, Grounded at last arrives on Sony's machine. In fact, this is my first time playing Grounded since its early access build on Xbox One and PC back in 2020, so it's long overdue a reappraisal. Today I have PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, Series S, PC, and also the just-released Nintendo Switch edition in focus for review. From the top, Grounded is a survival game in the mold of Valheim or Ark Survival Evolved that lets you loose on a garden in miniaturized form. As one of 4 teenagers shrunk down to the size of a figurine, you wake up to a jungle of clover leaves and looming grass blades. You evade spiders, navigate all manner of discarded gadgets and junk, scavenge for food, and above all, through the power of science, seek a way to return to your normal size. The premise calls to mind Andy's Garden from Pixar's Toy Story or even Disney's adventure comedy Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. It's a great survival-themed backdrop, deploying heavy bokeh depth of field to truly sell the scale of its world. We're not getting an all-guns-a-blazing showcase for Unreal Engine here by any means, but still, it's a fun idea with solid execution, featuring a day-night cycle, plus some beautiful volumetric lighting effects. Impressively, these latest ports to PlayStation 5 and Switch include crossplay by linking to a Microsoft account, and all of this lets 4 players combine forces online to build structures and survive the creatures of the garden. So how exactly do these new releases of Grounded compare visually to the existing Xbox Series X and S versions? Does the PS5 edition see any change to its graphic setup, in shadow quality especially, as with the recent Hi-Fi Rush? And how about its bid to run at a stable, locked 60 FPS? Lastly, looking at Grounded on Nintendo Switch, cutbacks are inevitable given the mobile-based nature of the hardware. Some leniency is needed here, all things considered. Still, does it put out an enjoyable handheld experience regardless? Let's find out. Let's get straight to the comparisons with a focus on PS5 first. For such a simplistic game, stylistically, you'd hope for some parity with Series X, and yet there are a few key differences here. Point number 1 is the resolution target. On PS5, we're getting a dynamic range between 1080p up to a peak of 1215p, or thereabouts, which is the most typical number in my pixel tests. In fact, even looking directly up at the sky, or across complex bits of the garden, it often runs at 1215p here. What we're left with is a softer image than Series X by comparison, which by contrast gives us a much higher dynamic range between 1512p up to 4K. That is, it runs at 4K while looking right at the sky or directly downwards to lower GPU load, but closer to 1512p in regular play. Zooming in, this shot overlooking the mushrooms here spells out the difference best. Pixel counts on this exact frame show a native 1620p on Series X against 1215p on PS5, and yes, some clarity is lost on Sony's console as a result. It's an unusually wide divide that warranted a lot of repeat testing, but ultimately the numbers were consistent every time. And finally, we have Series S on the far right there, which targets 1080p as the absolute max figure. Series S is dynamic as well, with occasional drops to just below 1080p, to 1026p or so, but it's rare to see any major deviation under. It's a conservative target for the 4 teraflop machine, though at least it pushes 1920 by 1080 consistently. These lower figures seen from PS5's dynamic resolution are strange, especially given the state of its frame rate, which I'll get to shortly. Otherwise, it's worth stressing that most other visual settings, with a few exceptions, are identical. Shadow map LODs, texture quality, effects are all matched in this round forward between PS5, Series X, and even S. Curiously though, geometry LODs like the draw distance for small rocks up ahead run at a higher setting on PS5 overall. It happens time and time again. Items across the floor draw in farther afield on PS5, meaning less visible pop-in up close. Meanwhile, Series X renders small objects at a slight delay by comparison, closer to the camera, while Series S is a setting below even Series X, with even more obvious object pop-in. So for example, check out this top-down view of the opening area. Switching between PS5 and Series X, it's clear there's a higher geometry draw setting on Sony's console all round. It's a clear-cut advantage in this aspect at least. Okay, we've got the resolution difference, which favors Series X, and the geometry LODs, which favor PS5, which brings us to point number 3, the shadows. There's a difference in the presentation of shadows on PS5 and Series X, which echoes my colleague Oliver's mixed findings in his Sea of Thieves tech analysis, another Unreal Engine title ported to PS5. It's also not precisely clear what's causing the difference either. Looking at interior shadows to start, Xbox Series X and S use the same setting between them, which by the way is a match for PC's high setting. But then there's the PS5 situation. These are sharper, more cleanly defined shadow outlines overall. And for context, if we swap out the Series S and throw PC into the comparison on its Epic setting, what we get on PS5 comes in between Series X and PC in overall clarity. Without question, PC does have the best shadows of the three if your GPU allows it. And to put this into further perspective, here's all 4 of the PC version shadow settings laid out from low to epic. Low and medium are a huge step down, obviously, while Xbox Series X and S use the high setting. But there isn't anything that's exactly equivalent to the result we're seeing on PS5 here. So, is this a PS5 advantage? Well, not always. Grounded is an unusual game in that shadow casting occurs from so many different altitudes, different heights. The oak tree, the house looming over the garden, everything produces a shadow on the ground from a great range. Plus, closer to the ground, you cast your own shadow, as do the creatures crawling through. In every case, shadow filtering is necessary to reduce aliasing and noise, and it's this shadow filtering setting, above all else, that appears to be creating different results between PS5 and Series X. If we switch between the two consoles, the shadows cast from grass blades overhead are sharper on PS5. In this case, PS5 ends up chiseling out more detail, more definition on the shade. On the other hand, there's a downside to the way PS5 approaches shadow filtering. During this pan around the inside of this laser contraption, Sony's console suffers from extra aliasing on shadow lines cast from high above. The turnout on Series X is obviously much more pleasing. It's filtered, softer, but does remove that stair-stepping. And in this final example, we have character shadows. Looking down at the floor, PS5 produces much more aliasing. Again, more visual noise and flicker as our character sways on the spot. Series X, by comparison, has a more diffuse outline, but it appears the advantage of its heavier filtering method is that it hides the visual noise of the raw base shadow outline. Then again, what confuses matters even more is that this PS5 approach, with more visual noise, appears to be a match for PC's epic setting. That's enough on shadows. The situation there shows a mixture of fortunes depending on the console. In some cases, PS5 might be a preference, in others, the Series X approach works better. Beyond that, it's worth noting a few other differences. For one, the game's distinctive bokeh depth of field effect is impacted by the different native resolutions on PS5 and Series X. Given that it is a post-processing effect, the detailing varies across out-of-focus points in the frame based on the overall resolution, and so it follows that Series X often produces a cleaner effect. You get less aliasing on the fringes of the grass blades here, for example, where they intersect with the depth of field, which is more of an issue on PS5 and Series S. Beyond the differences in object LODs, shadows, and the resolutions though, the three machines here are very close in world detail settings. The only final thing to note is that, sadly, Series S is being marked out once again as a 1080p machine. Essentially, we're seeing the HUD, the UI, and the text on Series S all presented at 1080p, whereas PS5 and Series X bump these elements to 4K. We'll get to the Nintendo Switch shortly, but first, here's the results in frame rate on everything we've seen so far. Xbox Series X, to start, is a solid 60 FPS throughout, barring occasional one-frame drops and the odd hitch while autosaving kicks in. The general rule of thumb here though is that you do get 60 FPS. However, even at 60 FPS, that is 60 unique frames within a second, there is some odd perceptible judder anyway. I'm putting this one down to irregular camera update intervals. Since the Series X is outputting 60 FPS, it's just that lateral camera motion still reveals judder at times, and the same goes for Series S. The drop in OLED settings and the lower dynamic 1080p resolution all result in a quite stable 60 FPS line, with even less frequent one-frame drops than Series X. Bizarrely, at least in my testing, Series S might be the smoothest version of the current-gen consoles overall, but not by a huge margin. It just avoids some of the small one-frame blips while navigating the world and picking up items. All round though, and barring the odd camera judder, both Xbox machines are nicely optimized ways to enjoy Grounded. Switching to PS5, we see a very different result. On its latest patch 1.02, we're getting a 60 FPS line in parts, but too often we see it plummeting into the 50s or even down to 45 FPS. It depends on the complexity of the scene, of course, and the time of day is a factor too. In tracking through all the same steps as the Xbox consoles though, there's no question PS5 struggles to hit the top mark. These are more than the odd blip, and rather are fully sustained drops across segments of the garden. Players without a VRR-compatible display will notice the lurches to 50 FPS quite easily, though VRR will smooth this over if you have it. As to why these drops are so frequent on PS5, the cause isn't clear. The trade-off in visual quality, bearing in mind PS5's lower average resolution than Series X, doesn't quite stack up here. Partly, this might be due to the difference in other settings, like the object LODs, which is a preset higher on PS5, plus there's a difference in shadow quality too, which has to be accounted for. Both of these are factors, and potentially there are more minute differences across the world in PS5's favour. Still, it is a surprise to see PS5 so regularly bouncing between 50 and 60 FPS, and it's in need of better optimization, no doubt. A better balance between visuals and performance. Putting PS5 aside, let's see the situation with Grounded on Nintendo Switch. It'd be unfair to expect anything close to the dedicated home consoles in visual quality, and really the goalposts are quite different for a portable machine, where the value here is surely in taking Grounded on the go. To that end, just about every setting is dropped to suit the Tegra X1 chipset's limits and to hit a stable 30 FPS. The resolution, while docked for a start, runs between 720p and 360p, though 600p is the most typical number in regular play. Also, the install size of the game is reduced to just 3.1GB on Switch, which is a third of the 9 to 10GB install on, say, a PS5, Series X or S. There's a lot of crunching down of asset quality going on here. Texture resolution is lowered across the garden, presumably to fit into the Switch's limited 3.5GB of usable RAM. By comparison to Series S, for example, there's also more pop-in for textures, grass, geometry, shadows, and even the insects crawling through too. The depth of field effect is gone, motion blur is axed entirely, volumetric effects and light shafts are disabled, character self-shadows are removed too while looking down at your feet, and overall, decorative detail is reduced up close, meaning fewer rocks and leaves strewn across the ground. Grounded's presentation on Switch takes a radical hit. Indeed, when it really hits the lower bounds of its dynamic resolution, down to 360p during this time-lapse moment, it's a rough return while playing docked. But fundamentally, we have a PS5, a Series X, or PC for the big screen experience. And to Switch's credit, it does keep the core framework of the garden in place. The physics of the swaying grass blades are maintained as giant spiders or ladybirds crawl through. We even keep extras like screen space reflections on water. By necessity, the mechanics of the garden still line up with the PlayStation and Xbox versions for crossplay, even if surface level details like shadow draw and textures don't match up. It's certainly not always pretty. The texture pop-in sticks out like a sore thumb, and really demands getting within touching distance of an object to see a fully loaded asset. Also, the initial loading time is a lengthy wait, often over a minute on Switch. All of this goes for the portable experience too on Switch, as captured directly, and as a side note, visual settings are identical in this case to the docked version, albeit running with a lower typical resolution within its 720p to 360p range. The final test then, how well does Switch run at 30fps? Well, right off the bat, we're running into our eternal nemesis, uneven frame pacing. Even at a decently solid 30fps lock, the frame times are all over the place on the left side graph. Also adding to the issue are semi-regular traversal hitches, causing brief hang-ups in play as assets stream in. CPU contention and memory bandwidth are typical bottlenecks on Switch for complex open worlds, and it stands to reason that these are the culprits for hitches here. On top of that, we have the very same autosaving stutters that we see on PS5 and Series X. These are more sizable in nature on Switch overall as it attempts to save to its internal storage, but thankfully you do have the option in the menus to lower its frequency. As for actual sustained GPU side drops on Switch, Grounded runs well 95% of the time. Most outdoors areas hang at 30fps, but, and this is a big exception, our first encounter with the lab under the oak tree does drag us well into the 20s for a spell. It's tough to navigate through these rickety frame times here, though on the upside, it is unusual to see gameplay hit so heavily. Grounded's introduction to PS5 and Nintendo Switch isn't a smooth one, and especially with Sony's latest hardware, the lacking performance is hard to excuse. Running at between 45 to 60fps with worse image quality than Series X, albeit with higher settings elsewhere, is far from an optimal balance. It's a very strange turnout. The handful of Xbox Game Studios titles that have landed on PS5 so far have revealed unusual differences, like the differing shadows in Hi-Fi Rush, but at least performance has been equivalent. For Grounded though, in a cross-play game between a PS5 and an Xbox Series X, I know which one I'd rather play right now. Looking at the Nintendo Switch version, on the other hand, the inherent limits of the hardware put it in a different league to those top-end machines. As ever, it's just fascinating to see how it works purely as an academic exercise, to see if it can be done. The many visual cutbacks here do mean we get to 30fps, but realistically, as a way to enjoy Grounded in the long term, it's a hard one to really recommend. At a push, playing on Switch's smaller screen might help hide some of its issues. It's just a steep uphill battle to enjoy it with its uneven frame times and heavy pop-in. One to be wary of then before making a purchase. And for now, the best optimized Grounded experience is still on Xbox Series X, S and PC. That's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.